We're living in a golden age of Capcom, and more specifically, a golden age of Resident Evil. At first I didn't think that was possible. I've seen disappointment after disappointment in the Resident Evil series, and when I thought they would never change, Capcom released Resident Evil 2 Remake, and it truly was a step forward for the series and for the survival horror genre. Not only that, but it's now one of the best selling games in the series. Capcom wobbled with the Resident Evil 3 remake, they got too greedy and flew too close to the sun, but they're now firmly back on course with Resident Evil 4 Remake. It is a masterpiece and well deserving of the 10 out of 10 reviews. You can tell the end goal with Resident Evil 4 Remake was to make a good game, and not just make money by outsourcing the development with a tight deadline, which was the case with Resident Evil 3 Remake. It has been said that the original Resident Evil 4 was a step forward for the survival horror genre. However, I've always said that the original Resident Evil 4 was not a step forward but a step backward. Capcom retreated towards the action genre. When I first played the original Resident Evil 4, it felt so different to any other Resident Evil game I had played up until that point. I always considered it a unique game and not part of the series. That's why the thumbnail for my original Resident Evil 4 video calls the game Haunted Spaniard Castle. So to me, Resident Evil 4 Remake is Haunted Spaniard Castle 2. In my original video, I made the argument that parts of the game feel more like a fire temple in Zelda than it does a Resident Evil game. However, I did say that even though it didn't feel like a Resident Evil game, it was the best action game on the GameCube. Emphasis on the word action. However, that was the original Resident Evil 4. The Resident Evil 4 Remake was made in a post-Resident Evil 2 Remake world. It wasn't until Resident Evil 2 Remake that Capcom made a step forward for over-the-shoulder survival horror. And I was happy to see that Capcom extended the new third-person survival horror elements from the Resident Evil 2 Remake and added them to the Resident Evil 4 Remake, making it more of a survival horror than the original game. That intro was the long way of saying that the original Resident Evil 4 has more action elements and the remake has more survival horror elements. My views on survival horror have evolved over the years. I used to say a game is either a survival horror or it's not, but now I believe it's not so black and white. In my Tormented Souls video, I introduced a new concept when talking about survival horror games. I called it the survival horror spectrum. Some survival horror games have more action elements than others, and some have no action elements at all, which would place them higher on the survival horror spectrum. I now want to introduce my new and improved survival horror spectrum because my views have changed again slightly since my first version. I would place the original Resident Evil 4 quite low on the spectrum, and I'll get to reasons for this later on the video, but that was the original Resident Evil 4. It was a step backwards for survival horror. But what about the remake? Where is it on the spectrum? In this video I'm going to explore that question. Where the Resident Evil 4 Remake is placed on my spectrum, and how does it compare to the other Resident Evil games in terms of its survival horror elements? The following statements are both true. Resident Evil 4 Remake is a survival horror. Sometimes. Resident Evil 4 Remake is an action game. Sometimes. Both of these statements are true at the same time depending on several factors. Things like your weapon and character upgrade status, your playstyle, whether you use stealth or not, and other factors that aren't in your control like the new Crimson Heads and the save system. For this video I'm going to focus on a few of my survival horror rules, but I'm only going to focus on the rules that are interesting to me when it comes to the Resident Evil 4 Remake. So let's start with the most interesting golden rule number 2, no control over how successful your attack will be. This rule was written back when I was making videos about traditional fixed camera survival horror games, where there was no precision aiming and you would just aim roughly in the direction of the zombies and it would take a random number of bullets to kill them. Sometimes you would be lucky and score a headshot, but it was random and you had no control over it. The original Resident Evil 4 broke this rule because it added precision aiming, which of course gave you more control, but also another feature. When an enemy was shot below the knee, they would drop down and you could perform a roundhouse kick. This was almost certain every time you took a shot below the knees. Fighting enemies in the original game was very predictable, and when enemies are predictable, it means you have control. Horror can only happen when you are not in control, so giving the player precision aiming and an easy trigger to a roundhouse kick made Resident Evil 4 move more towards the action end of the spectrum. You can't be both a vulnerable character and be in control at the same time, which feeds into golden rule number 6, playing as a vulnerable character compared to the enemies you're fighting, but more on that later. In some ways there is less control with your attack in the Resident Evil 4 remake, and you no longer have the certainty of dropping a player to their knees when you shoot them below the knee. This certainty is no longer present in the Resident Evil 4 remake. Sometimes an enemy will go down from a shot below the knee, but it's not always certain. In this example, I have to shoot the enemy 3 times below the knee before he drops. So it certainly feels like you don't have as much control over how successful your attack will be, even with precision aiming. The enemies in general feel more robust and much more like the Resident Evil 2 remake zombies. Speaking of control, another feature Capcom removed in the remake was the red dot sight. You can buy the red dot sight, but we'll get to the upgrades later. This isn't a big deal, but it is a step towards removing the precision aiming and giving you less control, at least early on in the game. And again, is a step towards survival horror. Fun fact, when I played the original Resident Evil 4, I never used to use the roundhouse kick gameplay mechanic. I knew it was in the game, but I was used to the older style Resident Evil games, so being able to kick felt a little unnatural. Let's move on to golden rule number 5, having to evade the enemies. There's a new stealth mechanic in the Resident Evil 4 remake, which at first felt unnatural to me, but it's something I didn't know I wanted in a Resident Evil 4 remake, but I absolutely love. And the good thing about it is, this isn't just a new gimmick, you actually get to use it quite a lot throughout the game, and it's a very useful mechanic to have. The last stealth survival horror that comes to mind is Alien Isolation. Stealth is often underused or badly implemented in horror games. For example, in Evil Within, there were lockers that you could hide in throughout the game, but other than the one scripted section at the start of the game, I didn't find any other part where it was actually useful. But the Resident Evil 4 remake stealth really works. It is of course entirely optional, you can go in guns blazing if you want, but then you'll make the game lean towards an action game. But why is stealth a survival horror element, and if so, isn't Metal Gear Solid a survival horror? The answer to that is of course no, but it's all about context. In this horror context, the stealth is all about avoiding conflict or having to evade the enemies. You're not gunning down every enemy as you would in a typical action game like Gears of War. Evading enemies in Resident Evil 4 Remake isn't only done through stealth. There are plenty of times where you can run past enemies just as you would have done in the traditional survival horror games that came before it. Resident Evil 4 Remake does have Crimson Heads, albeit much more streamlined compared to the Resident Evil 1 Remake versions. Instead of slowly turning over time, they turn in a matter of seconds, and just like in the Resident Evil 1 Remake, you can stop them from turning. In the Resident Evil 1 Remake you would burn them, but in Resident Evil 4 Remake you can use your knife. But what does this have to do with survival horror? Golden Rule 6 is playing as a vulnerable character compared to the enemies you're fighting. The Crimson Head zombies are stronger and harder to kill than even the standard zombies, so including them in the game makes it lean towards a survival horror. To counter the argument for Resident Evil 4 Remake being a survival horror, let's talk about the action elements in the game. Starting with the action elephant in the room, the upgrade system.
Welcome. I got something new for you.
This is by far the biggest determining factor for whether you're playing a survival horror game or an action game, and it's what makes Resident Evil 4 Remake unique among survival horror games, because very few come to mind that let you upgrade your character. I'm not saying that Resident Evil 4 was the first game that ever allowed you to upgrade your weapons, but for me it was the first that made it a core feature of the game and did a very good job of implementing it. It's so addictive to upgrade your weapons. Normally I hate collecting items in games, but the upgrade system makes it worthwhile looking for treasures and picking up gold. It also adds so much replay value. Being able to carry over weapons to the next playthrough and upgrade a different weapon next time is a big incentive for multiple playthroughs. More important for me is that the upgrades don't ruin the survival horror experience until you're on your second or third playthrough, but when you're on those playthroughs you've fully ranked up and broken golden rule number 6, playing as a vulnerable character. You cease to become a vulnerable character when you are fully ranked up. It's also worth adding that the game doesn't let you upgrade everything right away. For example, the Red 9 can't be fully upgraded, and many weapons can't be bought until later in the game. Not that you would have enough gold to buy them anyway. Another golden rule the game breaks is scarce resources. There is an illusion of having low ammo and health, but just like the original Resident Evil 4 and Evil Within, the enemies always conveniently drop health and ammo when you need it. So these resources are no more scarce than in any other game where you have to pick them up. You have to pick up ammo in Gears of War, but no one's saying that it has scarce resources. Let's look at each of the resources in detail, starting with my favourite, the new extended food system. Health is now more abundant in the forms of the new food. As a side note, I absolutely love this new feature, and the food doesn't feel out of place. You could always eat the chicken eggs in the original, and when you think about it, in all Resident Evil games you're eating herbs. This is an example of Capcom expanding something from the original game. You can now catch fish, and the snakes from the original game can now be eaten when killed. It makes the game feel more like a survival horror, like you're living off the land. It's a genius move really, and one that I didn't expect or even consider, but I love it. When I first seen that killing and eating snakes was part of the game, I couldn't help but think of Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. It's hard not to feel like Resident Evil 4 Remake is ripping off Metal Gear Solid 3, but it's not like Leon wears Solid Snake's iconic eye patch. Oh wait, never mind. I really like how Capcom expanded the lake section. You can now drive around it on the speedboat, visiting different parts of it and doing some backtracking, and even enjoying some fishing. Fishing for the lurker bass just felt like I'm trying to get the Hylian loach. And when I caught it, I just have to laugh at the size of this thing. This is a big boy. I could barely fit him into my case. I have to make room with all of this other fresh produce. Leon's out here living off the land with herbs and eggs. I have to admit it's a little absurd, but Resident Evil 4 always was a little cheesy, so honestly this just feels normal. However, as much as I love the new food items, it does make the game lean more towards the action side of the spectrum, because it just means there's a lot more health everywhere if you look hard enough. Even inside the castle I found a small fountain full of fish. Not to mention you can actually buy health off the merchant. Every time you meet the merchant in a new spot, he'll be able to sell you a first aid kit, and this can be stored in your typewriter to be used later. Yellow herbs increase your player's total health. This was also in the original game, but it's another upgrade system which when fully upgraded means you become less of a vulnerable character, which goes against Golden Rule 6, playing as a vulnerable character compared to the enemies you're fighting. Which brings us to the next resource, ammo. Although I wouldn't say that the remake gives you an abundant supply of ammo that you would get in other action games, the Resident Evil 4 Remake ammo seems scarce. However, this is an illusion. A very good illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. Because just like in the original game and in games like Evil Within, the enemies drop ammo and health when you need it most. If you don't need ammo or health, I've noticed that they drop gold instead. Carlos also gives you ammo when you need it, and this happens anytime you play with him. I've tested this a few times in a few different sections of the game. It only seems to be handgun ammo, and only ever when you're low on ammo. When you get to below 10 bullets with your pistol, Carlos will throw you an extra 20 bullets. And this is even with me playing on the pro difficulty. In this section of the game, you have to survive as long as you can or kill all the enemies, so it makes sense that the game will give you enough ammo. But I just want to make the point that because of this, the resources are not scarce like you would find in other survival horror games. And also these sections in general are just more indicative of an action game. You can also buy crafting resources from the merchant, which lets you craft bullets. And like I said earlier, you can buy first aid sprays and then store them for later when you need them against the bosses. Speaking of the bosses, the game gives you the ammo and health you need right at the bosses too. I will say that through some testing, this only happens when you're low on health and ammo, so it's just a lifeline to help you get through. The bosses will only spawn health or ammo when you're really low. So you might be wondering, what's the big deal? The game helps you out a little. Most modern games do this. Again, this is not criticism. I love that Capcom modernized the game, but I'm looking at this from a survival horror perspective. Scarce resources is a golden rule of survival horror, and perhaps the Resident Evil 4 remake doesn't break this rule, it certainly does bend the rule. If you compare it to Resident Evil Code Veronica, where you could easily get save trapped if you didn't have enough ammo or health to fight the next boss, and believe me, I know from experience, because I had to restart Code Veronica towards the end of the game. I made the mistake of only using one save slot, so I had to start all over again. Speaking of being save trapped, that brings me to my next resource, saving. Remember the old ink ribbons? You don't have none of that here. In the old Resident Evil games, saving was a resource because you could run out of ink ribbons and lose the ability to save. Both the original Resident Evil 4 and the remake have eschewed the ink ribbon system. Now you can save as often as you like, which in terms of pace is a welcome change from the old Resident Evil games. I find the ink ribbon system frustrating. It was an interesting system back in the day and added strategy to gameplay, but I don't think it has its place in Resident Evil 4. We have looked at the different survival horror and action elements of the Resident Evil 4 remake, but where does this leave us with the genre of Resident Evil 4 remake? I mentioned earlier that the original Resident Evil 4 has more action elements in its gameplay than survival, and I placed it third on my spectrum. So if the original is at 3, where is the remake? You have heard of gender fluid. Resident Evil 4 remake is genre fluid. The answer is it has to be at position 5 on the spectrum, which is the neutral position, halfway between action and survival. Like I said earlier, it travels along the spectrum. When you first start the game on a brand new playthrough, you're at 7 on the survival horror spectrum. But on your next playthrough, you carry over your upgrades, so you're about a 5 on the spectrum. And by the time you fully rank up your character, your briefcase, your weapons, it's a 3 on the spectrum, because at that point the game is basically an action game. In conclusion, Resident Evil 4 Remake might not be the highest game on my survival horror spectrum, and the more upgrades you unlock, the further down the spectrum the game will slip, but to me this has the perfect blend of survival horror and action that truly deserves the 10 out of 10 ratings. And it looks like a next gen game, which I'm sure has something to do with the Quixel Megascans that were used to create the environments. I haven't been this impressed with environments since Resident Evil 1 Remake and Resident Evil 0. In fact, this nighttime storm section kind of reminds me of being on top of the train in Resident Evil 0. Which is wild that a GameCube game can be compared to something released in 2023. So much care and attention has gone into every section of the Resident Evil 4 remake. In some ways, I don't even see it as a remake. Parts of the game are barely recognisable, to the point where it feels like a sequel, but at the same time it's very true to the original, which I know sounds like a contradiction. Resident Evil 4 Remake is a modern day classic. Now that Capcom have perfected the survival horror formula, it's my hope they will use what they've learnt to make many more survival horror games in the future.